Hello everyone, and welcome to our first installment of Ask a Historian, or at least the installment that is the answers and discussion. I'm Matthew Wilkinson, I'm the historian with Heritage Mississauga, and before we start, I just wanted to say a thank you and a note of appreciation to all of our frontline workers out there who are working so hard to keep people safe and healthy. Thank you for your time, your effort, and your commitment. For the Ask a Historian sessions, we're offering people to engage with us in different ways as we all work from home and adjust our working schedules and working lives during the outbreak that we are dealing with. The idea of being apart together and ways in which we can communicate and connect to people who might be interested in our local history and seek ways to explore the world around them. So in that, guys, we've received several questions, and so our effort here is to engage in discussion and try to answer some of those questions. Our first question comes from Don, and he was looking for information regarding historic Burnhamthorpe Road, particularly from the 1930s and 1940s, and as his mother worked on a farm and boarded on a farm in the 1940s during the war years. So Don, you reference in your question the Shaver family, and one of the things we can look at when we do some property records and historic maps, there were two Shaver farms. One was on the north side of Burnhamthorpe Road, almost at the Etobicoke Creek, and one was on the south side of Burnhamthorpe Road, immediately west of Dixie Road. So one of the ways in trying to navigate the historic landscape, if you are, is to try to make some connections on what is known in that community. We can look at some of the historic family names that are within the area along Burnhamthorpe Road, whether it be Carr or Curry or the Doherty or Doherty, depending on the pronunciation and spelling on the generations, and of course the Shaver family, amongst others. And so hopefully some of those trigger kind of memories or stories that have been passed down of the time living along Burnhamthorpe Road. There's not a singular source of information really for the 1930s and 1940s. It involves a little bit of digging. The census records aren't available yet for that time period. They only go up to 1921, though it's currently available. But there's other ways you can delve into and discover some of the stories of the community, and one of which is property records, trying to find out who lived on certain properties, particularly given a point in time, and using that information to correspond to records that might be at the Region of Peel archives at Pam and Brampton, particularly the William Perkins Bull family files, which were compiled in the 1930s, looking at the families throughout historic Peel County, and including those that would have lived along Burnhamthorpe Road, likely the Shavers therein. Other ways we can look at community church records, cemetery records, family stories and genealogies that might have been collected. But we have to start with the names, and so that's the challenge. Once you have the names, you can start delving into other aspects of things. So we may have to wait until some of the repositories, like the archives, are back open to the public and engaged in kind of public searches and whatnot, and property records and things. We're happy to help with that, but in a way, it's a needle in a haystack kind of search. So there are answers out there, just involve a little bit of digging on that realm. So happy to help, and we can sleuth this together as time progresses. But again, Shavers are a good way to start, and you will find within that area there's a Shaver trail, or a walking trail, that's named after the Shaver family, and so history peeks through in many different ways. Second inquiry we had was about the rifle ranges down on Lakeshore Road, or the former rifle ranges, collectively as part of the Arsenal lands. The rifle ranges are no more. They closed operations in 1957, but they have a long history in our community. The rifle ranges first came to the Lakeview area in 1891 when the entire Ontario Rifle Association purchased land on the south side of Lakeshore Road, just to the west of Dixie Road, between Dixie and Cawthra. And they purchased a swath of land between Lakeshore Road and Lake Ontario, and they established 3 rifle ranges, a short, medium, and long range for testing and competitions and training and the like of armaments, of small armaments, guns of different kinds, if you will, for lack of a better word. I'm not a military historian per se, so not entirely expertise on the type type of ammunition and weaponry used, but nonetheless the rifle ranges were a significant component in our community for a number of generations. So beginning in 1891, they had come to Lakeview. Previously in the 1860s, they were established right in downtown Toronto and were seeking for a new home after they were no longer welcome on the Canadian National Exhibition grounds, as you might imagine. So they referred to as the Long Branch Rifle Ranges, although they were located entirely within Lakeview, which is part of Mississauga today, of course. And they hosted competitions, rifle competitions, as well as military training, particularly for the First and subsequently the Second World War. They were the local recruiting base for the 36th Peel, now known as the Lawrence Scots, as well as a primary training camp leading up to the First World War. We have pictures of some of the garrison components of the tents in the field and the barracks being built and the like of the rifle ranges ground. So quite a significant component for a number of times. The rifle ranges continued to be used, although diminishing after 1946, and finally by 1957, largely in part due to political pressure here in Toronto Township, what is now Mississauga, the rifle ranges were more or less evicted. They were told to find a new home, and eventually they did. They moved up to Meaford, Ontario, and so the operational facilities that were within Mississauga relocated in 1957. And in turn, after 1957, a number of the buildings associated with the rifle ranges, including the barracks buildings, were utilized for temporary civilian housing, and that eventually came to an end. The rifle ranges were sold for development purposes, and very little reminder of the rifle ranges remains on our landscape to this day. Another question we had, this one from Anne Marie, about the Canadian establishment of a vineyard in Cookeville, or the birth of the Canadian wine industry in Cookeville. And that is a story that is kind of morphs between legend and reality, and one of the more common ones we get little tidbits on over time. If you've driven into Cookeville along Dundas Street or along here Ontario, you'll find signs that say "Welcome to Cookeville Village, home of the Canadian wine industry," and referencing a picture of a place called Chateau Claire. So what is the true story of it? And Anne-Marie, if you're interested, I can send you some articles written by the late Professor Richard Jarrell on the birth of the Canadian wine industry, and particularly that of Clare House in Cookeville, and he does an amazing job of winding his way through the myth and the reality of the process. In short, Cookeville was home to the first Canadian vineyard and winery. That is true. What legends on the myth is when it started and who started it. There are several versions of the story, but the gist of it is that Corporal Johann Schiller, a retired military officer, received a land grant here in 1808. That is true. On the north side of Dundas Street, just to the west of what is now Confederation Avenue, Corporal Schiller received a land grant here, Lot 17 of the first concession north of Dundas Street. And the story is somewhere around 1811 or 1812, hunting near his property, perhaps along the banks of the Credit River, he stumbled across some native grapes, and taking these cuts or these seedlings back to his farm, he is said to have planted a vineyard that became the first in Canada. The only problem with a story like that is there's absolutely no historical evidence to support that actually happened. What we do know is in 1859, when Justin de Courtenay proposed to establish a Canadian vineyard, there was no operational vineyard in Canada, nor was there reference to one ever having happened. So we have their beginning stages of it in 1859, and we take the story of de Courtenay and we partner it with a business-interested family, the Parkers, Hector and Melville Parker in Cookeville, and they entered into a partnership in 1860 with Justin de Courtenay, and they established in 1864 the Canadian Vine Growers Association in Cookeville, operating the first commercial vineyard and winery in Canada, known as Clare House. What's the link between the story and Schiller? It's the land itself, the property. The Parker family purchased the Schiller property in 1841. And so the link is geography, not necessarily the individuals themselves involved. Certainly the Parkers and de Courtenay were the linchpins behind the development of the vineyard. The vineyard really was at its height between 1864 and 1875. It's remarked at that time that they produced over 50,000 gallons of wine and a considerable amount of fine brandy, for those of us who like our alcoholic beverages. And so yes, Clare House in Cookeville, the first of its kind in Canada. After 1875, a number of different operators owned the vineyard and continued to operate it in its waning years as it diminished, and coming to a close in 1925 or 1926. The name Clare House largely disappears, and it's only in retrospect that as far as we understand, that the term Chateau Clare is applied. At its time, it was referred to as Clare House, and looking back in time, locals began to refer to it as Chateau Clare after the fact. But nonetheless, a remarkable story, a little bit of a confusion of the myth and legend at the beginning years, but 1864 to 1926 are the accepted dates for the Canadian Vine Growers Association in Cookeville for producing product under the name Clare House. Hope that helps. From Frank, we have, where does the name Mississauga come from? Great question, Frank. It is one that is endless fascination and can branch off into numerous discussions of local history. In short, the name Mississauga was chosen by the residents of Toronto Township for the new name of their city come amalgamation. The name was chosen in December of 1967 by popular vote, which was held in the Mississauga News. The already named Mississauga News, the newspaper took its name in 1963, and there's a little bit of truth to the story that the newspaper named the town. However, the name Mississauga was in use prior to that. Mississauga Road was already named south of Dundas Street. The Mississauga Golf and Country Club took its name in 1906, albeit they spell it slightly differently. And of course, the indigenous Mississaugas, we are within their traditional territories, and that is the birth of the name itself. So the name was in say, vernacular use before it became official at the end of 1967, and the town of Mississauga was born officially on January 1st of 1968. And so our residents chose the name. But your question, I think, was more along, what does it mean? And there are really two accepted versions of it, both very similar. The one is River of the North of Many Mouths, and the other is Many River Mouths. The name Mississauga doesn't refer to this place at all. It's a name that was applied to the indigenous people who referred to themselves as the Anishinaabe. To early English traders, it became the Mississaugas, and it referred to their ancestral homeland, which is where the fur traders first encountered them, and that was along the north shore of Lake Huron between the French and the Mississauga River areas. Geography and conflict brought the Mississaugas southward into southern Ontario, eventually establishing their base, if you will, or their connections to the Credit River Valley and the Lake Ontario at the mouth of the Credit River. So the name came with them, in a sense. So the name, River of the North of Many Mouths, does not refer to this place at all, but nonetheless is a name applied to the indigenous peoples who once lived in this area and whose traditional territory we are in today, and a name selected by the residents of Toronto Township for the new name of their amalgamated town in January 1st of 1968, the town of Mississauga. From there, a question from Merle and Sue, looking at Fifth Line West, and Fifth Line West, near and dear to my heart for a very odd historian's reason. One of my favorite pictures I've taken are road signs at that intersection at Dundas Street and Fifth Line West. Fifth Line West and Dundas Street West. How do two west roads intersect? Next time you drive by that, I guarantee you're going to look at it a little differently. But yes, indeed, on our landscape, two roads labeled west intersect at right angles. That's not the nature of your question, though, so perhaps we'll leave that for another session as to why that's the case. But Merle and Sue, you were asking about a series of wartime houses along Fifth Line West, and some of the history of that area. Fifth Line West is an original surveyed line dating back to 1806, and as a survey line, it also divided farm properties, one to the east and one to the west. South of Dundas Street on the west side was the Faulkner property, later purchased by the Belfords, and on the east side was the Young Farm. On the north side, the Adamsons owned both sides of Fifth Line, just a little bit north of Dundas Street. And so I'm not entirely clear of the houses you're looking at in particular, but the houses along Fifth Line on the east side of Fifth Line, south of Dundas Street, there was a series of 7 or 8 what would look like wartime bungalow houses, very small. There's a couple of them still tucked in there, I imagine, with some alterations over time. But they were built largely in the late 1950s by an Arundel builder, if you will, Rudy Christensen, and he had his hands along some of the houses that were built along Fifth Line West, south of Dundas Street. North of Dundas Street along Fifth Line West on the east side, the opposite side of the road, were a number of wartime houses, typical wartime houses, about 7 or 8 of them in a row, that were built on subdivisions of land from the Adamson family, who owned the surrounding farm property. And in conjunction with the Veterans Land Act of the 1940s, they subdivided part of their property with the intent to sell those lots as building lots to returning veterans. We're a little unclear whether that actually happened, whether the people who bought those properties were veterans or not, but nonetheless, a number of small, what we would consider wartime era houses were built along that stretch of Fifth Line West. None of them survive today, but so you might be referring to either one of those. So that's a tidbit, Merle and Sue. Perhaps there's other things we can look at as well, but quite happy to chat about Fifth Line West. Very proud that little stub of a road survives within our evolving community. And we're going to end our first session on Ask a Historian on that. There are a couple of other questions that came in as well. We're going to endeavor to answer all of them as we go forward in time, but thank you for joining us, and look forward to chatting with you again as we go through this and explore this way of interacting on local history together, and look forward to future conversations. So keep the questions coming, and let's have some fun exploring local history. Take care.